All right, so what we've gone over is this whole idea of suffrage and the idea of who can vote, and we talked about its evolution, and then we talked about, okay, at this point in our history in the United States, everyone except for felons in some states and people under the under the age of 18, those are the only people who are excluded from voting, and everyone else now can vote. Then we looked at voter turnout, and what we tried to show is even though you have the right to vote, there are very different patterns of voter turnout depending upon your age, depending upon gender, depending upon income, depending upon education. What we want to talk about now are types of elections. So what do we vote on? And in the United States, there are two types of elections that we talk about: issue elections and candidate elections. And when we talk about issue elections, what we're talking about are elections on policies and laws. Policies and laws. The one thing that I want to make sure you understand when we talk about issue elections is that this applies only to the state elections. That the national government does not have an issue election approach. That when we talk about issue elections, and we have issue elections here in Ohio, as a matter of fact, for those of you who are going to vote, there's various issues you can vote on. For example, whether or not you support your schools, whether or not you support your parks, all of these kinds of things. So what we want to do is talk about issue elections first. And there are three types of issue elections: referendums, initiatives, and recalls. And I want to explain each one and then give you an overview of how they are distributed across the United States, because every state has their own independent influence in regard to determining whether or not they're going to allow issue elections. And some states allow it, and some states don't, and some states allow for certain things, but not other things. So, a referendum. A referendum is a direct vote by the people on a law or constitutional amendment to a state constitution. So it allows the people to directly vote on whether or not they want to institute a law or amendment that affects policies in that state. So just to give you an example, numerous states, including Ohio in the past, have voted on the Defense of Marriage Act. How are we going to define marriage for the state of Ohio? We have voted on marijuana issues. Do we want to legalize marijuana for medicinal purposes, which we have? Do we want to legalize marijuana for recreational purposes? And different states have had different approaches and philosophies in regard to that. So that's what we mean by a referendum. You get to vote directly on an issue. As I said, this does not exist at the national level. So we don't get to vote on national policies. And maybe it's an idea whose time has come, and maybe we should amend the Constitution, allow it. That's up to you guys in terms of whether or not you as a society want to fight for that ability to vote directly on issues like funding of abortion or gun control or anything else that can be considered a national issue. The second type is what we refer to as an initiative. Now, an initiative is the procedure by which voters can propose a measure to be decided by the people in a referendum. So an initiative allows voters to place an issue on the ballot in the form of a referendum. In some states, they allow for initiatives, and the people, if they get enough signatures, can put an issue directly on the ballot themselves. In other states, they say that a referendum can only be proposed by that state's legislature and governor. So you don't necessarily have to have an initiative to have a referendum. And then the last type of non-candidate form of election is a recall. And a recall is the process of removing an elected official from office. So 20 states have that. Wisconsin, Minnesota, Kansas, Georgia, Louisiana, many others. And what it does is voters can place a recall on the ballot and determine whether or not they want to remove an elected official. And in this context, the most common way it's been used is against governors, and that was what had just happened in Wisconsin about a year and a half ago. So a recall is a way you do not have to wait for the next election. If you think that a particular elected official is doing a very bad job and you don't want them to serve out their entire term, some states allow for recalls. Now, if you look at your book on page 184, what it shows is how various states react to these kinds of approaches. So as you can see, they have dark blue, and dark blue are states that have all three of these. They have initiatives, referendums, and recalls. And the gray ones, states, have none of the three. So when you look at this table, and I'm going to hold up the book. What you can see, I hope, is that there are a lot of blue states out west, and there are a lot of gray states in the east. So there seems to be a significant regional difference between whether or not a state allows issue elections or not. The east generally is opposed to it, and the west seem much more willing to adopt this approach. So as you can see, there is tremendous disparity in regard to the use of this approach. Okay, so those are issue elections. The next thing we want to talk about are what I refer to as candidate elections. Candidate elections. In candidate elections, obviously the things that you as students probably are the most familiar with. And clearly, candidate elections are the heart of democracy. The whole idea of representative government, of government by and for the people, our right, our obligation to choose candidates who then have to represent our beliefs and ideas in regard to the legislative and executive bodies of our countries. Well, when we look at candidate elections in the United States, one of the things you have to understand is how prevalent they are. And what I mean by that is in a presidential year, like this year, 2020, voters across our country will choose more than 500,000 local, state, and federal officials. 500,000. You're like, how could that be? That sounds like so much. Well, it is, because we're talking not just about national elections, obviously, but we're talking about national, state, and local elections. So not only are we going to vote for the president and the vice president, not only are we going to vote for 435 members of the House, not only are we going to vote for about a third of the Senate, but we're going to vote for governors of numerous states. We're going to vote for state senators in every state. We're going to vote for state reps in every state. We're going to vote for county commissioners, county prosecutors, auditors, treasurers, and in many states, judges. So in Ohio, for example, you get to vote on your common pleas judge, your court of appeals judge, your Supreme Court judge. And again, multiply that times 50 states doing this. So in Ohio, we have 99 state representatives who meet in Columbus. We have 33 state senators. So right there, we have over 100 elected representatives. And again, multiply that times 50 states. And in some states, the number of state reps they have are a lot more than 99. In some states, it's less. Every state has their own approach. Every state determines how many they have. Every state determines what the terms of offices are for these different individuals. In some states, you don't get to vote on judges. They're appointed by the governor, or they're appointed by panels. In our state, they are elected. In some states, they're partisan elections where they list the judicial candidate's party affiliation, Democrat or Republican. In Ohio, they don't list that in the general election. So every state is very different. But the point is that there are numerous elections, and this is the heart of democracy, an election. Now, when we talk about candidate elections, we want to talk about this as a two-stage process in the United States. And what we're going to focus on for the purposes of this class are just national elections. So we're going to look at the questions of, and the only things that we elect from a national election perspective are President of the United States and our Congress. And the Congress consisting of the Senate and the House of Representatives. So what we want to do in looking at candidate elections is understand it as a two-stage process. A two-stage process. So first, we have the nomination stage. That is the selecting of the candidate for the Democratic and Republican Party. And then we have the general election stage, which is the nominees for the Democrat, the nominees for the Republicans, face off against each other and determine who's going to represent that state in the United States Senate or in the House of Representatives. So we want to look at this, and then we're going to break it down by congressional elections versus presidential elections. And what we're going to show is that the way we elect members of Congress is different than how we elect the President of the United States. So let's take a look at this in more depth. The first thing we want to understand is the nomination stage, the nomination process. In other words, again, how do we select the nominees for the major parties that want to run for election to Congress or the President of the United States? How do we do that? How does the Republican Party pick its nominees? How does the Democratic Party pick its nominees? And when we look at the nomination process, there are two major strategies that you can use to select the nominees of the party. And the two major approaches are primary systems or a caucus system. So primary versus caucus. And every state gets to decide which nomination process it wants to utilize. So what we want to understand is what's a caucus and what's a primary. And they're very different. And I want you to think about which one do you think is better. So some states have a caucus. And what's a caucus? A caucus is when party leaders assemble, and they can assemble at convention centers or things like that, and they debate and decide amongst themselves who they believe is best qualified to be their party's nominee, whether it's the nominee for the Senate, nominee for the House of Representatives, or nominee for President of the United States. So candidates are invited, and the party leaders, the ward leaders, the district leaders, the precinct leaders assemble and decide amongst themselves who they believe is best qualified. So this is different than a primary. A primary is where party nominees are directly chosen by the registered voters of that state. So it's an actual election day. You have an election like we were just supposed to have here in Ohio, right? You go to the polling place, there is a list of who's running for what, and the average person gets to decide. So in one system, the average person gets to decide, and the other system, it's just the party regulars. And the question is, which one do you think is better? Now, generally when I ask that question, students overwhelmingly say primary, so that we all have an opportunity to vote. But let's think about this. How much does the average voter really know about these candidates? Do they really know a lot about their backgrounds, how informed they are, how intelligent they are, how articulate they are? Or are they influenced by imagery and TV commercials? I mean, one of the things that we find is that party regulars know a lot more about these candidates. They know a lot more about the issues. They know a lot more about the stands of these candidates over the years and how consistent or inconsistent they've been. And a lot of people believe that we should use a caucus system. That if we use the caucus system, a guy like Bernie Sanders wouldn't be having so much success, because here's a guy, Democrats will say, look, this guy's never even run as a Democrat. He's run as a socialist when he ran for senator of Vermont. So how in the world can we give him the Democratic nomination? It doesn't make sense. And by the same token, I mean, you can kind of make that same argument on the Republican side. Donald Trump was a registered Democrat for over 20 years. And he changed his position on numerous issues, including abortion and gun control and things like that. So the party regulars said Donald Trump should not be the nominee of the Republican Party. And if you remember, there was a big fight about that at the Republican convention 4 years ago. That was in Cleveland. And as a matter of fact, the Republican governor of Cleveland was so upset that people had nominated Donald Trump, he refused to attend the convention and said Donald Trump is not a Republican, does not represent Republican values and approaches. And he should never be our nominee. So that's where Trump comes up with the term, the never Trumpers. And he's right. There's some people who believe he never should be the nominee of the Republican Party. So those are the two different approaches. And when you talk about a primary, what I want you also to know is that there are different types of primaries. So you can have what's referred to as a closed primary or an open primary. And let me define these for you. In states that have a closed primary, what that means is a voter must declare their party affiliation prior to an election, generally when they register to vote, and they can only vote for the candidate of the party of which they are a registered member. So New York and California have this approach. You register to vote, you say whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, and then when you show up on election day, they just give you that ballot. You don't get to choose. Now, what that also tends to mean in these states is that if you're an independent, you don't get to vote in the Democratic or Republican primary. And partisans say, and that's the way it should be. We only want people who are real Democrats and real Republicans voting for their nominee. We don't want someone who's an independent, has no stake in our party, to have any influence over our nominees. Then we have what's called an open primary. And for an open primary, in the states that have them, voters need not declare their party affiliation when they register. And they can vote for the nominee of either party, but only one. So in other words, you show up at your polling place on election day, primary election day, and you say, I feel like a Democrat today. I lost my job, I'm pissed off at society. Hey, government help me out, these rich people are ripping me off. Or I feel like a Republican today. I won the lottery, I'm now worth tens of millions of dollars, I don't want to pay taxes anymore. But the point is, you can vote for either party, but only one. So Michigan, Minnesota, Vermont, Wisconsin, a large number of states have these types of primaries. Now, interesting enough, looking back to the last presidential election, Bernie Sanders did much better in states that had open primaries. Donald Trump did much better in states that had open primaries. So you could see why they would like this, and you could see why party regulars might not like them as much. Now, in general, what we've seen in the United States is there have been a trend away from caucuses to more primary states. So let me give you a history of this. In 1948, in the United States, 37 states had caucuses, with only 13 having primaries. So most of the states chose the caucus method in 1948. 38 to 12. Well, by the year 2000, this changed. So by the year 2000, what we see is only 14 states had caucuses, and 36 states had primaries. So it's changed. And if you look at this last election, some of these states now also have primaries. So the figure, depending upon whether it's Democrat or Republican, has raised to about 38 or 39 states that have primary systems. So only the minority of states have caucuses today, a complete change. Well, one of the questions you might want to ask is, what's the significance of that change? What's the significance of that change? And this is where a lot of people, again, would argue, as some of the party members do, that what it's led to is candidates having to be less beholden to the political party and the rise of media candidates. So it's no longer what you know, what your ideology is, where you stand on the issues, and how consistent is it with Republican or Democratic politics, but how photogenic are you? How dynamic are you? What your personality is. So that more and more people are voting based upon personality, and what some people call the cult of personality, rather than where a candidate stands on the issues, how knowledgeable, experienced, and informed they are. So it's led to more media politics and the ability of candidates to saturate the media. And what we find is the more media time a candidate gets, the more support they're able to garner. Now the question becomes, is that the best way to select our nominees? Well, as we said, there's been tremendous change over time. So that's the difference between primary and caucus. Now what we want to talk about is, how do we choose the congressional nominees and how do we choose presidential nominees? And how do you know who the nominee is? So, when we talk about Congress, every state, as we said, determines whether or not they're going to have a primary or a caucus. And then the way it works is these candidates stand for election for whether it's the United States Senate or House of Representatives. And whichever one of those candidates gets one more vote than their opponents, that person becomes their nominee. You do not have to have a majority. So if there are 4 different candidates for the House of Representatives or the Senate, whichever candidate gets one more vote than their opponents, that's who the nominee for that party will be, and that's called plurality voting. Plurality voting. Now when we look at presidential nominees, the presidential nomination process is a lot different. It's a lot different. The question is, how do you know who the nominee is? Well, it is a very complex system. Each party determines the total number of presidential delegates that there will be in the United States. So every state gets a certain amount of presidential delegates as designated by that party. And what is it dependent upon? A lot of factors. The population of that state. So obviously the larger the state, the more presidential delegates they'll get. Whether or not the state voted for their party the last time in the presidential race. So if that state voted for the Republican nominee and it's a Republican nomination process, they will get more delegates as a reward for having voted Republican. Same thing with the Democrats. So each state determines how many presidential delegates there will be. And the Democrats usually have more presidential delegates, generally somewhere around the 4,000 figure. And once you get a majority of the presidential delegates, you become the presumptive nominee of the party. So for example, if you've been looking at any of the primary elections, they'll talk about in order for the Democrat to win the nomination, they have to have over 1,900 delegate votes. And Joe Biden has this many, and Bernie Sanders has this many, and here's how many are left. And that's why a lot of the stations are saying that Joe Biden is clearly going to be the Democratic nominee. All right, so every state then determines how they're going to choose those presidential delegates. Are they going to use a primary system or a caucus system? And this has a major impact on presidential campaigns. So if you are running a candidate's election to be the nominee of their party, the question is, what kinds of things will you consider in determining where you're going to send your candidate and where you're going to spend your money? I mean, the first thing we have to understand is that when you look at this presidential nomination process, it starts in January and it goes through June. So you're talking about a 6-month process where these 50 states distribute, have on different dates their primary or caucus. So which ones are you going to go to? And what happens when there's 7 or 8 on the same day? Like there is for Super Tuesday. You can't go to all of them. So what kinds of things determine nomination strategies? And there's 3 major things. First of all, there's what we call the big state strategy. So obviously, the more presidential delegates a state has, the more important that state is and the more time you want to spend there. So when you're talking about big states, you're talking like New York, California, Florida, Texas, those are important states. Those are important primaries. But that's not the only factor. Another factor that you look at is what we call the early states. So, what state has the very first presidential nomination? It's actually the state of Iowa. It has a caucus. Well, the state of Iowa is a very small state. But guess what? It's incredibly important. And it's important because it's the first. And because it's the first, everybody wants to win it because they know it'll generate a lot of free publicity. So all the candidates on the Democratic side worked really hard to do well in Iowa. And when Biden lost it, you had people saying, that's it, his campaign's over. And then the other factor that you look at is, what states will my candidate do well in? So, if my candidate is from the Northeast, I want to spend more time in the Northeast when there's those elections, because those elections I know I can do well and I can win. Or if my candidate's from the South, I want to be able to campaign in the South because that's a region that's familiar with and is going to be much more likely to vote for me. And then the other thing that influences is what kind of nomination process is there. So, again, if I'm Bernie Sanders, what states do I want to run in? I want to run in states and campaign in states that have open primaries. Because I know among hardcore Democrats, I'm not going to do as well as I will do with independents who are allowed to vote in an open primary. So all of these factors have a major impact on campaign strategy. Now, once all the states have their nomination process, whether it's a primary or a caucus, then what happens is the next stage in the nomination process for President of the United States is the National Convention. The National Convention. So that's when all of the delegates assemble, and it's usually a 3-day process, and they cast their votes for the nominee. Now, the convention is considered to be pretty important. Even though we know who the nominee is going to be at that point, the convention does a lot of things. So, for example, in 2016, the Republicans had their convention in Cleveland. The Democrats had theirs in Philadelphia.